Well, thank you very much, Craig. I think you'll be happy to hear that young people in Canada are starting to be exposed to your report. When I speak at high schools, it's very impressive to take this big document and go thump, there. And I leave it for the schools' libraries. Okay, so it's making its way into high schools in Canada, and I imagine certainly in the United States through other speakers. But one thing I did this year in the climate course that I teach at Carleton, we have about 400 students. I made the top prize for the highest mark in the class was a copy of your report. And I'm happy to tell you that the person who won it was a journalism student, okay, a climate science course, and he's already active writing for mainstream media, and he has a copy of your report because he came first in the class. So that's really good. Our second speaker today, of course, is Professor Fred Singer. He's also an expert on scientific evidence. Dr. Singer is Professor Emeritus of Environmental Science at University of Virginia. He's also the founder and president of the Science and Environment Policy Project, which you can find on the web at sepp.org. Dr. Singer's specialty is atmospheric and space physics. An expert in remote sensing and satellites, Professor Singer served as the founding director of the U.S. Weather Satellite Service. More recently, he served as vice chair of the U.S. National Advisory Committee, on Oceans and Atmosphere. In 2007, Professor Singer founded and chaired the NIPCC that we just heard about now. As many of you know, he's also the co-author of that massive and invaluable report. He's also the co-author of a popular book called Unstoppable Global Warming Every 1,500 Years. So Dr. Singer has 25 minutes, and I'm happy to pass the lectern over to him. We'll have questions at the end.
Thank you, Tom. Oops. I'm going to discuss the differences of opinion between NIPCC and IPCC and address what I think is the most fundamental problem, which is the cause of climate change anthropogenic, human caused, or is it natural? I think that's the fundamental issue. I'll be talking about three different results. First, discuss the controversy about the consistency between observations and greenhouse models that will tell us what the cause of global warming is. Then I'll talk about some of the drawbacks of the models, the uncertainties that exist with all climate models, particularly those of the IPCC. And finally, I'll say a few words about the reality of the data of the 20th century and mention what we've learned from ClimateGate and from the hockey stick. I hope to bring you some new information that you might not have heard before. The question of attribution revolves around the question of the disparity between the models and observed temperature trends. Do they agree or do they not agree? That's the issue. And that's been, I thought, was settled. And I'll remind you very quickly that it was discussed in a U.S. government report called Temperature Trends in the Lower Atmosphere. That is a standard report published in 2006. It's the report number 1.1. It's the most important report, and it has the stamp of approval of all the scientists who worked on it, in particularly the IPCC scientists who used some of the same information. We have used that information, and all we did was to compare carefully what's in this report. This is all discussed in the first of the NIPCC reports, and as the title suggests, we reached the conclusion that nature, not human activity, rules the climate. And you may recall, I'll just remind you of this, the disparity between the models that show the hotspot and the observations that do not. That's all been discussed in the last 2 or 3 years, and described in more detail in a publication by Douglas et al. Here you see that the models, the trends increase with altitude, reaching a maximum at about 10 kilometers, and the observations, which are taken with radiosondes in balloons, show a decrease. In fact, the trend is slightly negative and falls off very rapidly. Now, naturally, our conclusion that the anthropogenic effect cannot be seen in the data, and you don't see it here in these data, has been attacked. And the attack came, the most important attack came from a scientist at the Livermore lab, Ben Santer, whom some of you may have heard of, and 16 co-authors. It's like the who's who of the IPCC. They wrote this paper, and that's my exhibit number 1. I'll show you this. And I'll show you how their attack comes about. What they try to show is that there is no disagreement between the models and the observations. And the funny thing is that only a year earlier, they had shown these results. Okay? Here's my exhibit number 1. You'll recognize our work with Douglas. These are the balloon observations, and now we plot the trend, and here's altitude, and these are the models. Look at the yellow region, and you see the yellow region disagrees with the observations. The observations show a decline of the trend. The trend becomes slightly negative, while the models show an increase in the trend. The trend is positive. So what have Santer and co-authors done? Well, first, they invented a new set of data. Here they are. You see them? These are not really data. These pretend to be observations, but they're not really observations. They're based on calculations. But they're published. So they've put them in there. And then the second thing they did was to increase the error bars on the models from the yellow region to the gray region. And now you see, wow, you get an overlap between observations and models. And they are consistent. Oh, they say they are consistent. But they're not really. In the first place, the new data sets, these here, are spurious. We've been able to show that, and we've published that work. First published by Christie, and now have published a paper which shows that they do not agree with the satellite data. And the second thing is, we can also show that the error bars, or the width of this gray area, is an artifact. It's not real. It's an artifact of the models that were used by the IPCC. And that brings me to my second point. The second point has to do with models. What determines the uncertainty in the models? When you read about models in the literature or in IPCC reports, they will tell you that the models show a certain trend with altitude. They don't show you how they reach this trend. I bet you've never seen it. They do this by running the model several times and then averaging the runs. How many times do they run these models? Well, if they're careful, they run them 3 times. Some models actually run them 5 times, never more than 5. And now I will show you exhibit number 2, which I bet you've never seen, because they don't show you the results of individual model runs, except in special cases. In this special case, this is my summary of section 2. Here it is. This is published by the Japanese modelers in Tokyo, and they were honest enough to show the results of each run. They did 5 runs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you see here are the runs. They're 20 years each, And for each run, they get a trend. Let me show you what the trend is. For the first run, they get a trend of 0.042 degrees per decade. For the second run, they get a trend of 0.348. That's almost 10 times as much. Each run gets a different trend. Each run has a different trend. So my question is, which one of these trends is real? Which one would you compare with observations to determine if the models agree with observations? Number 1, number 2, 3, 4, or 5? And the answer, of course, is none of the above. None of the above, because when you average these 5, and here they do that, they get a different number. But how do we know that this number is correct? Because if they were to do another run, number 6, which they never did, they would get a different number again, and therefore a different average. So now the question becomes, how many runs do you have to make before you get a reliable trend value? That question has never been addressed by the modelers. And the reason is very simple. It's very expensive to run a model. It takes time, costs money. None of the IPCC models have been run more than 5 times. Most of the US models, and we have 3 models in the United States, are run about 3 times to get averages. We've done a little investigation in this, and we found, and here's the summary, that you have to run at least 10 runs in order to get a reliable value. You have to average 10 runs or more before you get an asymptotic value that settles down and doesn't change anymore. And that depends on the length of the run. If the runs are short, like 20 years, you have to run 20 runs before you get an asymptotic value. So the answer is that in practice, this means that the IPCC models, which have only 1, or 2, or sometimes up to 5 runs, cannot be validated. They're not reliable. We don't know what the trends really represent. So that was my exhibit number 2. I now turn to the third part of my talk, and those are the data. We're finished with the models. Now we go to the data. We're going to focus on a particular period, 1979 to 1997. Let me show you the standard data. You've all seen this. If you look at the global temperature record, and this happens to be the GIST data from NASA, the Goddard Institute of Space Studies, but they're all about the same. You see, first of all, a warming from 1910 to 1940, then a cooling for about 35 years, and then they show another warming here. I believe this is the US record. I believe that this warming here between 1910 and 1940 is genuine, real. It really exists, and I can demonstrate that. I believe that this warming shown here is not real, does not exist. Is it fake? We don't know. We won't know that until the ClimateGate investigation is finished, because these data were constructed by the people at the Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia, in some ways by some kind of selection and homogenization process, which they haven't told us about. We don't know what the selection process is. We don't know what their algorithm is. However, we have a number of separate methods of showing that this warming trend here does not really exist. So let me go back and quickly tell you what they are. If we look at this particular interval, because this is the crucial interval, 79 to 97, you see, first of all, that it doesn't, not shown in the US data, which are very carefully controlled. In fact, the warmest years in the United States, we know now, were in the 1930s. Sure, there was some warming shown here, but we don't know how much of this is due to the urban heat island effect. And some of the other problems with US data, Anthony Watts discussed this morning, so I don't need to repeat them. So let me tell you, just list for you the way we've looked at this. The trends in this period are not seen in the satellite data, and they're not seen in the independent balloon data. Neither one of these show a positive trend. They're not seen in the amplification that's expected from the theory of the atmosphere, so-called the moist adiabatic amplification. They're not seen in the sea surface temperature data. They're not seen in the data for the ocean heat content. And they're not in accord with the solar data. And finally, most important, the proxies after 1979 do not show a warming. The proxy data, that is the non-instrumental data, tree ring data and such, do not show a warming. And this data has been hidden. And that, I think, is Mike Mann's nature trick. You remember he stopped his record in 1979 because his proxy data did not show a warming. I'll come back to that. So let me show you, first of all, the satellite data, courtesy of Roy Spencer. From 1979, the beginning of the satellite record, to 1997, before you had the super El Nino, you see essentially no warming. I've actually calculated it. It shows that the warming is slightly negative. So you get a slight cooling. A slight cooling. It's consistent with zero trend. Then you get the El Nino. Then you get a jump around 2002. And then you get no change again from 2002 to the present. So the last 9 years show essentially no trend. You've seen this slide earlier today. This is the urban heat island effect. The slide is by Goodrich. It shows that in California, the most populous counties show a distinct warming trend. The less populous counties show a lesser trend, and the small counties that have less than 100,000 people show hardly any trend at all. A very, very good demonstration of the importance of urban heat island effect in California, where we have 107 weather stations because they have a lot of money, or they used to have a lot of money, and could afford to run them. Here is the famous hockey stick. And now most people, of course, have focused attention on the medieval climate warming and pointed out that the hockey stick doesn't show the medieval warm period or the Little Ice Age. And McIntyre and McKittrick have shown that the hockey stick algorithm is no good, that the statistical method they used is faulty, and so on. I have focused on a different point. My focus has been on the fact that the hockey stick record suddenly stops in 1979. It doesn't go on all the way to 1999, which is when it was published. So I corresponded with Michael Mann and asked him, what happened to the proxy data between 1979 and 1999? And he replied, there aren't any. That's a lie. That's just not true. Of course there are some, and I knew that when I wrote him his letter. So let me show you some proxy data. First of all, here are the data of Craig Lowley and Kaegwin, which show the medieval warming and the Little Ice Age. But let's go to the proxy data, which I will show no warming after 1979. So what Michael Mann did was to stop the hockey stick in 1979, and he hid his proxy data because he disagreed with Phil Jones' temperature record. So he's being politically correct. And the funny thing is, he was politically correct, but he missed being scientifically correct. Because if he had published his proxy data, he would have shown that there's no warming after 1979. And he didn't want to do that. He wanted to be politically correct and play along with the IPCC. Okay, here is a tree ring record, which actually is in my book, Hot Talk Cold Science, published in 1997. It shows the 1910 to 1940 warming, which is genuine, and shows no warming after 1940. No warming after 1940. I have now a whole bunch of proxy records. None of them show a warming after 1979. None of them. So I'm fairly convinced that the so-called warming of 1979 to 1997 does not really exist, or at least is extremely small. And that is the conclusion here. Number one, that the models and observations are not consistent, and therefore the earlier conclusion of the NIPCC is the correct one, namely that the anthropogenic effects are small, the human contribution is minor. I'm not saying it's zero, it must be, but it's unimportant. Secondly, we find no evidence for surface warming claimed by the IPCC in support of anthropogenic global warming. And as I showed earlier, the climate models use an insufficient number of runs to overcome chaotic uncertainty. Thank you very much.